The moment you feel completely trapped by a problem at work or a breakdown in a relationship is actually the exact biological and psychological condition required for your brain to level up its capacity. We are dissecting the concept of mental crisis today, specifically looking at how deliberate risk and unavoidable adversity force cognitive adaptation, a process beautifully detailed in Chapter 23 of Joe Bandel's book, The Oak Matrix Unleashed. Bandel argues that hitting a wall isn't a breakdown, but a breakthrough opportunity where our current mindset fails so a new one can be forged. Isabella, this flips the conventional script on anxiety and stress completely upside down. We usually treat a mental crisis as a disease to be cured or avoided, but Bandel is treating it as a developmental requirement.
He treats it as the fundamental engine of human growth, James. Bandel uses this powerful metaphor of a mental web. All of us walk around with a cognitive network of memories, beliefs, and past experiences. When we face a routine problem, our mind travels down these familiar, well-worn pathways to find a solution. It is highly efficient for day-to-day life. The danger is that this web becomes a closed circuit. If you encounter a novel situation and your existing web has no established link to a solution, you freeze. You feel overwhelmed. That overwhelming sensation is what Bandel defines as a mental crisis. It is simply the realization that your current set of skills and associations is inadequate for the reality in front of you. Instead of retreating, Bandel suggests that this friction is the only thing that can force the web to expand.
The instinct for most people is to retreat into what is comfortable. When the pressure mounts, we try to numb it or escape it. Bandel frames this tension through the lens of duality, describing it as a loving embrace rather than a violent battle. He suggests that the containing, restrictive pressure of a crisis partners with the generative drive for mastery. It sounds poetic, but I want to ground this in what is actually happening in our heads. We are not just talking about a philosophical shift, are we? There's a physical mechanism at play when we are forced out of our cognitive routines.
There absolutely is, and it maps perfectly onto what modern neuroscience tells us about neuroplasticity. For a long time, the scientific consensus was that the adult brain was relatively static. We now know that the brain constantly reorganizes itself by forming new neural connections throughout our lives. When you face a severe challenge that your current web cannot solve, your brain is forced into a state of heightened plasticity. It engages in a process called synaptic pruning, where it eliminates old, inefficient connections and simultaneously builds new pathways to adapt to the stressor. Bandel's concept of the containing pressure of a crisis is essentially the environmental stress required to trigger this neurological rewiring. Without that stress, the brain conserves energy and relies on the old web.
That aligns with the research coming out of clinical psychology regarding post-traumatic growth. Psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun pioneered this research in the mid-90s. Their data shows that depending on the study, anywhere from half to over two-thirds of trauma survivors report significant positive psychological changes after a major crisis. They measure things like a renewed appreciation for life, enhanced personal strength, and deeper relationships. Tedeschi and Calhoun found that this growth does not happen in spite of the crisis. It happens because the crisis shattered the person's existing belief system, forcing them to construct a more sophisticated, resilient worldview.
That shattering of the old belief system is exactly what Bandel is pointing out when he talks about the limitations of our mental web. He uses the metaphor of an oak tree to illustrate this developmental arc. An oak tree does not grow strong in a controlled, perfect environment. It requires the harsh, containing pressure of freezing winters and severe droughts. A drought forces the oak to push its roots deeper into the earth to find water, expanding its foundation. The harsh winter hardens the wood. When the expansive energy of spring returns, the tree is capable of supporting more branches and a wider canopy. The crisis is the teacher. If we avoid the drought, our roots stay shallow, and the first major storm will uproot us entirely.
I find the oak tree analogy compelling, but there is a risk of slipping into toxic positivity here. Telling someone who has just lost their job, gone through a brutal divorce, or faced a financial collapse that they are just a growing oak tree can come across as dismissive. Bandel is not simply saying we should smile through the pain. The distinction he makes is about active engagement versus passive endurance. He argues that we must own our role in the outcomes and stay mentally present in the situation. How does a person transition from feeling like a victim of their circumstances to actively using the crisis as a tool for cognitive expansion?
The transition requires a radical acceptance of the new reality. Tedeschi's research on post-traumatic growth emphasizes that acceptance coping, coming to terms with the fact that the old reality is gone, is the primary predictor of growth. Bandel approaches this by demanding that we take responsibility for our mental web. If you are stuck in a career rut, for example, your web is full of limiting associations, like the belief that you are underqualified or that the market is too tough. Acknowledging that these are just habitual pathways, not objective truths, is the first step. You stop blaming the external world and start looking at the rigid connections in your own mind. Bandel calls this moving from detached observation to concrete intuition, where you see exactly how your actions and beliefs are creating your current limits.
This brings us to the mechanism of change in Bandel's framework, which is deliberate risk-taking. He states that desires only manifest when they are aligned with physical reality, and risk is the bridge that connects them. Our culture heavily prioritizes safety and predictability. We buy insurance for everything, we plan our careers decades in advance, and we curate our social interactions to avoid discomfort. Bandel suggests this obsession with safety is actually self-sabotage because it starves the mental web of the novel stimuli it needs to evolve. He even claims that when we become too bored or safe, we will subconsciously create crises just to feel the excitement of the unknown.
We see that self-sabotage all the time. People blow up stable relationships or make reckless financial decisions out of sheer boredom. Bandel argues that nature and the divine intend for us to have an adventurous existence, experiencing the full spectrum of life. Instead of waiting for a subconscious, destructive crisis to upend your life, he advocates for chosen, deliberate risks. Taking a risk forces you to confront the physical limits of reality. If you want to start a business, your dream is abstract. Taking the financial and social risk to launch it forces your abstract dream to collide with market forces, taxes, and customer feedback. That collision is the crisis. It forces your mental web to adapt to the real world, turning a naive dreamer into a competent operator.
That bridges the gap between the physical and the spiritual in the Oak matrix system. Bandel views mental energy as the mediator between physical actions and spiritual insights. When you take a physical risk, you generate feedback. That feedback creates a mental crisis, which forces cognitive adaptation. This newly expanded mental web then allows for deeper spiritual or philosophical understanding. It is a continuous loop of development. If you remove the physical risk, the loop breaks. You are left with untested theories and a fragile mindset that cannot handle real-world turbulence.
Bandel offers very specific, practical tools to keep this loop active, ensuring we do not just read about these concepts, but actually integrate them. One of the core practices is the crisis journal. When you face a challenge, instead of venting about how unfair it is, you document your own responsibility. You map out the associations in your mental web. What beliefs led you to this point? Then you brainstorm specific risks you can take to expand that web. If you are terrified of public speaking and it is holding back your career, the risk is volunteering to give a presentation. The containing pressure of the fear meets the generative drive of your ambition, creating a new level of competency.
He also talks about the mastery ritual, which ties back to the oak tree. He suggests visualizing your mental web as the branches of the oak. You actively identify which branches are dead or limiting and conceptually prune them. Then you commit to a small, deliberate risk to grow a new branch. This intentionality is what separates someone who is merely surviving a crisis from someone who is using it as fuel. The goal is to build a lifestyle where crisis is not an emergency, but a recognized stage in the process of manifestation. The sophistication of your mental web determines the complexity and richness of the life you can handle.
Exactly. And he encourages sharing these risks with a partner. He notes a dynamic where men often default to looking for the expansive solution, while women might focus on the containing lesson, though these energies exist in everyone. By discussing the crisis with someone else, you blend the need for grounding reality with the drive for achievement. It reinforces the idea that duality is a partnership. We do not have to conquer our problems through sheer force. We can integrate the lessons they bring. By making risk-taking a weekly habit, like trying a new hobby or initiating a difficult conversation, you constantly feed your brain new data. This prevents the stagnation that makes unexpected crises so devastating.
We are essentially training our nervous systems to tolerate and eventually crave the friction of the unknown. When we reframe mental crisis as an architectural requirement for a stronger mind, the fear of failure loses its paralyzing grip. You begin to look at your overwhelming days not as punishments, but as the exact training ground you need to build a charismatic, resilient, and deeply competent life. The obstacles in your path are the raw materials for your mental expansion. If you found this perspective on using crisis to build cognitive mastery valuable, please share this episode with someone who could use a shift in how they view their own challenges.